Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the emerging role of APIs in healthcare. Our team here at Chilmark Research is united by the belief that effective deployment and use of IT is essential to modernizing care delivery and ultimately improving the patient journey to health. And the emerging trends and technologies to enable this is what drives our choice of research topics each year. It is our goal to provide objective, forward-thinking insights that will help create an informed market of stakeholders. To this end, Brian Murphy, our presenter today and lead researcher for the accompanying report that will be released shortly, has focused his energies since joining Chilmark Research on the problem of interoperability. Brian has been covering the HIE and interoperability space for Chilmark Research since he joined the team in 2012. He's done great work for us since joining, and we're looking forward to sharing his research with you in 2017. Unlike most of our reports, this one will be free to the public thanks to generous support for the research from Cerner, Intersystems, Orion Health, and PokitDok. We are very thankful to them for making this happen and working together to educate the market on this important topic. We will be answering questions at the end of this presentation, so please feel free to use the GoToWebinar panel to submit your questions as they come to you. We will try to get through as many as possible, but we will also be following up with anyone that would like to pursue the conversation after the webinar as well. All right, without further ado, let's get started. Brian, take the controls.
Thank you, John. Over the next 40 minutes or so, this is more or less what we're going to cover. The first half is just going to kind of set the stage. The second half will get a chance to get into the results of this research project. And then at the end, hopefully we're going to have 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So with that, this was a qualitative research project. We talked to 15 different organizations around healthcare and healthcare IT about the prospects for building the kind of API infrastructure needed to support the app ecosystems that are kind of so prevalent that you see. I'm going to share with you a little bit on kind of who we talked to and what we talked about, but first, just a couple of sort of high-level observations about the results. We're pretty convinced that APIs are basically the way forward for healthcare IT. It's that APIs are going to solve a whole raft of different problems. They are flat out just a better tool for developers than a lot of the techniques and technologies that we use in healthcare today. And by better, what I'm really talking about is something that makes programmers more productive. And they do this by abstracting away a lot of the data complexity, a lot of the application complexity, and lets the developer focus on function and usability that's relevant to their user base. Now, everybody in healthcare is aware that APIs are revolutionizing application development and integration, in the wider world and in all kinds of different industries. To just diverge away from healthcare for just a second, I read an interesting article last week that talked about the major kind of pure enterprise software hardware vendors, Cisco, Dell EMC, IBM, HPE, Oracle, and VMware. 4 years ago, they collectively did $221 billion in revenue. This year, those same companies are going to do a little over $200 billion in revenue. And if you compare that to somebody like Amazon Web Services, and I'm not suggesting that Amazon Web Services caused this reduction in income, but if you compare it to Amazon, they're growing 50, 60, 70% a year during some of that same time period. So things are happening in the wider IT world. And folks in healthcare, I think, are looking around and they're seeing that the technology that they kind of work with day in and day out really kind of represents the leading edge from say, the mid-90s. So there's a certain level of frustration, I think, that the kinds of software that you see here on this slide hasn't really taken hold in healthcare, which is not to say that healthcare is like some urchin outside with a runny nose pressed against the window looking at some glittering inside world here. These things are beginning to happen in healthcare. We talked to lots of different vendors, and I got to honestly say that almost none of the kind of new and small vendors that we've talked to over the last 2 years are really in the kind of on-premises traditional software kind of a business anymore. It is almost universal among this particular group that they're hosting not so much a product but a solution, usually on Amazon or Microsoft, and they're selling it as a service to HCOs. And all of these companies use APIs as kind of their lingua franca for development. They're using a whole host of other kind of modern DevOps tools. So these things, are creeping into healthcare. Even if you look at some of the very largest vendors, they use a lot of this kind of technology behind the scenes. It hasn't been exposed, I think, to their customers to the extent that I think a lot of people would be happy with. There's lots of different reasons for that. Cloud is still kind of a scary word for too many HCOs. When you hear words like HIPAA eligible, that doesn't necessarily mean HIPAA compliant, but getting something HIPAA compliant is not as much the insurmountable obstacle that it used to be. Another thing that's not lost on a lot of people is that companies are making a lot of money from APIs. Salesforce last year made $1.5 billion in licensing from their APIs. Now, this aspect is not necessarily, I think, going to be something that's going to be a slam dunk in healthcare, but a lot of HCOs are looking for new revenue opportunities, and we think that APIs are one way to achieve it. I think most broadly, the opportunity here is really to help support new ways to deliver patient care and kind of broader distribution of clinical expertise across healthcare. There's also a tremendous amount of duplication in HIT. If you just think about the number of times developers built, say, a penicillin allergy alert, once for every instance of every brand of EHR at least, and a lot of the same sort of reinventing the wheel is going on right now with quality metrics. There are vast opportunities in care coordination. I mean, care coordination, like it or not, is something that we do very badly in healthcare. So I think, to think of it as something other than a greenfield opportunity is probably not wrong. And I say that notwithstanding the number and variety of different care management products that are out there. This is an opportunity for IT in particular to really shine. The other thing that I think kept coming up in pretty much everybody we talked to is that the EHR is really kind of the be all and the end all for most, at least clinical users. And this is problematic. Everybody knows about the problems with EHRs. Physicians are not happy when they have to use these things. Physicians are also less happy when they have to jump out of that EHR to to find other data or to invoke other kinds of functions. So the idea that things have got to come kind of back to the EHR, I think, plays in pretty nicely with this sort of integration aspect that APIs bring to the table. So with that, let's jump into it. This whole idea of systems of record and systems of engagement. This is a way that a lot of people conceptualize IT. when we talk about healthcare, I think that people will tell you that a lot of the systems of record are seen as kind of too rigid, too hard to use, too costly, hard to maintain, hard to change, too siloed, too expensive. The list goes on and on. When you look at systems of engagement, I think people make a lot of those same points, that these things are too rigid, they're too difficult to use, they're too costly, etc., etc. EHRs have received a tremendous amount of attention over the last couple of years. I mean, it wasn't that long ago when relatively few physicians actually used them, but they are by far not the only applications in healthcare, and EHR users are not the only user community in healthcare. So we think that there are lots of opportunities for APIs to deliver value across the entire portfolio of applications. So we think that APIs really are going to be the dominant way that developers interact with applications and with other organizations. And we put up three kind of screens here that were not chosen at random that I think illustrate a couple of points. Amazon, everybody knows about Amazon Web Services. This screen that you're looking at, if you're able to make it out, is the Amazon API Gateway. This is essentially the set of APIs that developers can use to build APIs to the applications they host on Amazon. So Amazon is, has done tremendous things for developers. This kind of exemplifies it. The second one there is Salesforce. Salesforce has grown very fast, and it's used for a whole slew of line of business applications, and it works again almost exclusively through APIs. Salesforce has thousands of applications that people can download and use that kind of work off of Salesforce data. And then in the last one there is General Motors. They've got a set of APIs that lets third parties access GM data or GM cars, and it's essentially used to so that developers can add value to GM products and services. And I think it's important to sort of analogize these to healthcare. An EHR vendor could, in theory, put together an API program that's similar to Salesforce's. An HCO, a large healthcare system, could put together an API program that looks like GM's. This is not completely out of the range of possibilities, but there are some differences here between these three examples and kind of the whole cross-industry way of doing things and healthcare. To use any of these APIs, you don't have to interact with these companies at all. These APIs are open in the sense that anybody can kind of look at the documentation. You give them an email address and they'll give you an API key and you can start writing software. You can kind of build an application, you can test it, you can even deploy it with effectively zero interaction with these organizations. And it's difficult to see that translating in quite those terms with healthcare. Now, to be fair, if your application begins to drive a lot of API calls, these companies are going to be knocking on your door. So it's not, a completely free and easy. It's not as free and easy as free. Let's contrast that with the way data is made available across healthcare. So we've got. In healthcare, we are an industry that literally teams with networks and services that provide data. And these are just some examples. This is not an exhaustive list. I mean, we could have pages and pages of these. All of these provide some kind of value to somebody in the sense that all of them have found an audience in one way, shape, or form. But every single one of these has got its own onboarding, its own credentialing, different and unusual technical interfaces, documentation. Some of them require training. Generally, you've got to be a customer of these networks or the company or organization that sponsors it in order to get access to the documentation, never mind access to the network. In almost all these cases, there's a written contract with the fee structure that's got to be ironed out first before you can write a single line of code. These services tend also to be standalone. A lot of them are accessed via a portal, and again, grumpy physicians don't like portals. Sometimes these services are delivered inside of an EHR or through a PMS, but not always. None of them really allow developers to kind of access their service while they're modifying the workflow that the user is using. And again, this is not a comprehensive list. There's clinical content sources out there. There's messaging systems. There's lots of different stuff out there. Just a quick word about the 21st Century Cures Act. I think, I don't know if, to the extent you've been following it, President Obama signed this into law yesterday. Essentially outlaws the idea of information blocking. And without getting into a long discussion of what that is or isn't and whether it's intentional or not intentional, people are always pushing us to predict the future, and I am going to predict here and now that the enforcement mechanism here, decertification of your EHR or a civil monetary penalty, is going to be a dead letter. I just don't see, with all the hoopla surrounding our new administration, I just don't think that enforcement for something like this is going to be a high priority item. This is sort of the way we envision APIs kind of playing out in healthcare. You've got APIs that essentially provide access to developers who build applications on behalf of users. I think where this differs from our kind of existing ecosystem is first it leaves the data close to where it was created. So instead of data being packaged, bundled into documents or profiles or transactions and then shuttled around the system, the idea is that the data stays close to where it was created, where it can be read by anybody and changed pretty much by its creator. And we think that the read-only use cases are probably the lowest hanging fruit here and more likely to deliver good results early. Project Argonaut, for those who follow that, will tell you pretty much the same thing. Most of the use cases that they're talking about, all the use cases they're talking about are read use cases. A lot of the smaller IT vendors that we talk to in connection with this project, and I got to honestly say, in general, over the last 2 or 3 years, complain about not being able to write their data to EHRs, and they think their data should have a home in the EHR. And while I can certainly sympathize, I think that from the standpoint of crawl, walk, run, I think the industry needs simple read access before we start worrying about who's updating what data. So let's get into the survey itself. Just to kind of reiterate here, the purpose of this study was to solicit ideas. We wanted to, lots of people talk about APIs and their value in healthcare and as a catalyst for things like, innovation, new care models, better performing organizations and the like. But we wanted to dig just a little bit deeper to see how this could play out. So this is who we talked to, and this is what we talked about. So it's 25. We talked to 25 different people in 15 different organizations, and those organizations, I think, were a good representative of the people who are interested in healthcare IT. So it was HCOs, payers, HIT vendors, people who are in the healthcare data business, and device manufacturers. The largest number that we talked to were healthcare organizations, and with respect to them, all of them were either kind of hospital health system or large IPA type organizations. and mostly because it was easier to find someone in organizations of that size who are aware of APIs and are generally conversant with software. In the HCOs, pretty much every person we talked to was an MD, usually a CMO or CMIO. The HIT vendors we talked to were small relative to a vendor like a Cerner or an Epic. But the people that we talked to in those organizations were either founders or ran development or both. We had a discussion guide that basically had like 20 questions or so. And the average interview lasted roughly 45 minutes. Honestly, given how strong some of the opinions we got were, we didn't get to every single question, but in all instances we got to the questions that you can see here on the right-hand side of your screen, which I think get to the heart of kind of how this is going to play out. So this slide gives you kind of a high-level summary of the response. Is there another slide? Yeah. So these next two slides. First of all, everybody wants to see app stores in healthcare. Everybody uniformly thinks it's a great idea. Secondly, everybody also believes that building the API infrastructure needed to kind of make it happen is a relatively low priority for most healthcare organizations. But somehow or another, everybody thinks it's going to happen. Not everybody is thrilled with FHIR. FHIR, in case you don't know, is coming to us from HL7. It is essentially it's an API-based way to do a lot of the things that HL7 does, HL7 and IHE do. It's been around for a number of years. The production level draft standard is somewhere close to being final. It's really the centerpiece of the very largest HIT vendors' API strategies. Small HIT vendors and device companies, they tend to see FHIR as a way for the big vendors to kind of control captive HCOs. And anybody in the data or device business kind of has the same sort of sense about FHIR. When you talk to payers, a little bit of this kind of creeps out around the edges as well, to be perfectly honest. So I think it's fair to say that if the closer you are to kind of hospital EHRs, the more you kind of support FHIR, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a sec. And here's just some more. So in every single conversation, at some point or another, people just almost spontaneously began to volunteer ideas for new and different applications or new ways or different ways that APIs could be used. Some of these seem relatively straightforward. Self-service scheduling has been around for a very long time. Turning self-service scheduling on in a healthcare organization is less easy than building the application. Care coordination came up a lot, but a lot of ideas were really about kind of reconceptualizing healthcare IT kind of from the ground up. So applications that work more like a social app. EHRs that are not beholden to the documentation needs of payers. Patient apps that are not like portals, that actually activate patients. And I think the other thing that's important to note is that even though a lot of the folks that we talked to were clinical, there were a lot of non-clinical ideas. So people have lots of ideas about making the operations of healthcare, better and more efficient. So when we asked about opportunities and potential pioneer apps, I got to say that every single physician zeroed in on the problems with EHRs. And most of the other responders, most of the other people that we talked to talked about EHRs as well. So problems with usability, problems with documentation, problems with the flow of the application. I think that there's a real expectation that open APIs are going to make a difference in the EHR business. Another idea that kind of kept reoccurring was this notion of actionable data. Almost every conversation kind of touched on it at one point or another, and some of them were actually dominated by it. And when you probe this a little bit and begin to unpack what people are talking about, it really goes to the idea of relevance. So, most people will tell you, if you assume perfect access to all data about a patient, that by itself isn't really enough. It's still going to be useful for, to help a clinician figure out, which data is relevant and kind of what to do with it. Another idea that kind of came up a few times was helping physicians get to a diagnosis or treatment more expeditiously. So people seem to think that the incidence of missed diagnoses or misdiagnoses is probably increasing. So it's surprising how many people we talked to had anecdotes about patients who would go months before they got the correct diagnosis, or got a diagnosis and then went months before they got the right treatment. So, and I think most people tend to frame this issue as having less to do with skills and more to do with information availability. It's just this idea that given the amount given the demands on physicians, they just can't know everything that they need to know to diagnose and treat every single patient with zero defects. And a lot of people see APIs, in conjunction with things like machine learning and AI, etc., as a way to kind of enhance the diagnostic abilities of individual clinicians so they can, get to the right answer quicker. Another idea that I think dovetails on this is kind of this ongoing push to deliver more care in lower intensity venues and outside of traditional venues. Telehealth is big right now. Lots of organizations are looking at it. There's a lot of interest, and an API infrastructure, if it existed right now, I think would put people in a better position to build solutions. So when you layer in this idea of better distributing expertise, I think when you talk about lower intensity venues and non-traditional care venues, that distribution of expertise could definitely sort of goose the effectiveness of these alternative care models. So clinicians want all of these things to happen, but they are focused on change. They think of this really as a process change and not as technology is something that helps, but it's not necessarily a front and center thing for them. We talked to a physician at a large IPA who basically kind of summed it up. She said, we don't want Silicon Valley thinkers to go away. We want to work with them better. And that sentiment was expressed kind of over and over. We asked about who should really be the target for these kinds of new and different applications, and this question caused an obvious pause. Everybody stopped before they answered it. But I do think a slight majority think that clinicians are probably going to deliver a little bit more bang for the buck. After all, patients can't be their own doctors. But at the same time, nobody is ignoring patients. And I mean, the focus with respect to patients has been just kind of making sure that they've got some sort of raw access to their own data. The result to date for a lot of patient portals hasn't been, it's not been stellar. A lot of people talk about the number and the variety of different apps that exist, that you can download from Android or the Apple Store or from healthcare organizations. And say people don't really use these, so it's that's disheartening to a lot of people. But I've got to say, for the people that we talk to, there's still a really strong belief that apps could basically help create a more activated, group of patients. Get patients to adhere better. So patient engagement is undoubtedly a tough slog, but nobody's really given up on them. I think that the important takeaway with respect to this set of questions is that organizations are thinking about this problem of kind of who to target with applications at a systemic level. There's certainly a lot of focus on enabling frontline clinicians, but I think they are looking for opportunities wherever they can find them. So data. When you ask people what kind of data, API infrastructure should really be opening up, I mean, the go-to is EHR data. It's far and away the first choice, particularly among HCOs, which is a little bit ironic. They should have better access to their EHR data than anyone, but they're clearly not happy with the kind of access they have. And when you talk about data, people seem to basically hold two contradictory beliefs in mind. One developer said, it's not as if we are awash in available data. Another then said, well, getting data is actually bad because all it does is inundate users with information that they can't do anything with, because they don't really have the resources at the time. So there's this simultaneous belief that we've got too much data and not enough data. And again, when you begin to probe on this and ask questions, you find that the issue is really that a lot of the data is not especially useful at a particular point in time for a particular user. People want access to only the data that's useful to them in context and in a form that's digestible in that context. So I think that this points to not just a need for better access to the whole universe of data that's out there, but also for the ability to apply expertise to kind of sift through that data and figure out what's valuable in a particular context. So data and this idea of expertise, I think, are very closely related in this discussion. If the applications could somehow pluck out individual facts or set of facts from the humongous base of patient data that's out there, to make fast and accurate judgments, I think that would be the most desirable end state for the people that we talk to, especially the clinicians. So this is that's what they're talking about when they when you hear the word actionable data. This is really what I think people are talking about. And I'm not sure that anybody can credibly claim that the existing set of applications are great at that. And finally, the last point here that I think bears mentioning is that everybody is expecting the amount of data to expand or explode, depending on who you talk to. There's going to be more different data types, and some of them will be quite voluminous. So we also ask who's going to be willing to pay for this, because when you look at API efforts and app stores, it is certainly true that far less than 1% of those apps generate something like 95% of the revenue. It's almost a lottery type scenario, but it's got to be paid for somehow. So everyone we talked to paused before answering this question, and then they almost everyone also said, rhetorically, well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? And I think the answer is nobody really knows. There are some people out there who believe that that people are going to be willing to pay for raw data. I just don't see it. It's hard to kind of see that being kind of a dominant way that this happens. Now, one of the providers we talked about, I think, correctly pointed out an example where that actually does happen. I mean, e-prescribing is something that 10 years ago didn't happen in the United States. Nowadays, it's the dominant way that people do this, and providers pay for it. But that was done through a combination of the government telling them to do it and a genuine desire to kind of be more efficient and eliminate a lot of the back and forth that was going on with pharmacies. But we just don't really see raw data being a valuable asset. And again, people constantly will tell you that they're willing to pay for actionable data, which we talked about on that last slide. Okay, let's talk about the APIs for a second. Over the last 2 years, I think there's been a tremendous amount of attention focused on FHIR and just this idea of making the MU Common Clinical Data Set available through a REST API with a kind of JSON response. And FHIR is a tremendous place to start because I think it offers the a level of consistency across EHR brands that, frankly, we've been struggling with for years. The support for FHIR among the largest vendors and the largest HCOs is, I guess, it's rock solid. I would say. Support for FHIR among everybody else is less so. When you talk to the small HIT vendors, if they could get a REST interface to some sort of an extract or a data warehouse, a data mart, something along those lines, if they could get that today, rather than wait for the large vendors to build FHIR compliant APIs, they'd be happy as clams. But at the same time, those same vendors are they are resigned to the fact that FHIR is coming and that they're going to have to support it. So I think there's a very real expectation that FHIR is going to be, it's going to be part and parcel of everybody's product plans before too long. I think one of the things that people talked about is that their data needs are really broader than FHIR at this point. There's a lot of other data in HCOs that FHIR just doesn't address, ERP data, rev cycle data, lots of different device data. There's all kinds of things that people need to do with applications that FHIR does nothing about. There's interfaces, there's orchestration within and between applications. Ophthalmology has basically turned their back on FHIR. So not all clinical disciplines are on board. And there's a whole slew of kind of non-clinical data sources as well. So FHIR, by itself, is not going to address the industry's need for APIs. So we do think that there's going to be a big opportunity for not only vendors but HCOs themselves to build their own APIs, to suit their own particular purposes. Let's see. Just one note, one of the things that kind of came up is, people grumble about how their EHRs work. If you look at Google and Apple, they have style guides that developers have to use to produce apps. You have to follow these, or you get kicked off their store. Something like that, I think, would certainly help here. I'm not sure who's in a position to lead with this, but I think it could certainly help. In terms of who's going to lead this effort, I think universally people believe that it's the largest HIT vendors and the largest HCOs that have the time, skills, resources, and frankly vision to kind of pull something like this off. It's sometimes easy to lose sight of the fact that so much of healthcare is really is just a bunch of small businesses. Now that said, most of the large EHR vendors have API programs. most of them have or will soon have app stores. Some are a little bit more committed than others. Some have been at this a lot longer than others. And the same goes with HCOs. We're starting to see API programs at some of the academic medical centers, and some of them even, sell apps in an app store. But these efforts are just beginning, and you know, so I think that we are in true early days here. So, as far as conclusions are concerned here, this is more or less what we're recommending to people based on, the things we heard in this project. We're saying that, HCOs and HIT vendors should have an API program. Obviously, the largest vendors, a lot of them, largest vendors and a lot of the largest HCOs have already started, but even medium-sized HCOs should probably begin thinking about this. I mean, even though you may not get too much usage at first, I think it helps to kind of solidify some thinking around how these APIs should be rolled out, who gets to use them, what under what circumstances. We think it's that the user interfaces to EHRs need urgent attention. This would be one place to focus some attention. Payers, oddly enough, I think have been really missing from this discussion. A lot of the vendors we talk about, a lot of the HCOs that we talk about, they get once a month they get 30-day-old paid claims via FTP from their payers. Now, there's nothing wrong with FTP, and I'm not sure that everybody needs access to real-time claims data, but REST access to current paid claims would certainly help in a lot of care coordination scenarios. So although payers may have a deeper IT bench than a lot of provider organizations, we think that that there's more that they could be doing. So just to reiterate, this report is probably going to issue next week, like Monday-ish, and it's free for anybody who wants to get a copy. I think copies, you can also get a copy from any of our sponsors, I believe. Yes. Excuse me there. John was just pointing out that we've got other reports as well coming out this year. These are reports that are going to be on this topic of interoperability, clinician network management, market trends. That's kind of our way of describing health information exchange. So this is this is really kind of the beginning of, I think, what's going to be a fairly substantial coverage area for us in 2017 and beyond. And I guess at this point, turn it over for questions.
Thank you, Brian. So we have a few questions that have come in so far, and I would like to start with the first one, which is, where are the major vendors currently with respect to adopting a philosophy of open APIs and supporting third parties and other developers?
I think one of the things we mentioned, I don't think I talked about it, but it was certainly on the slides, but the pace of the rollout for FHIR has been fairly slow. And there's really good reasons for this. An API has it's a contract in the sense that it represents a long-term commitment on the part of a vendor to support a particular request and response. And most of the big vendors are kind of thinking through, what should and what shouldn't be in their APIs. Now that said, some of them are ahead of others. So you've got, folks like Athena and Allscripts who've been kind of beating this drum for a very long time. You've got a vendor like Epic, I think, is a little bit more, probably a little bit more interested in building up as much functionality as they can on their own. And then you've got somebody like Cerner that's somewhere in between. Nobody is saying no to the idea of APIs and outside developers, but so I don't think that any of those vendors vendors that I mentioned have, have a monopoly on the truth or a monopoly on the most appropriate approach. I think it depends on the circumstances of their customer base. But I do think that this 10 years from now, we will be talking about these kind of APIs in the same, they're going to look much closer to what Amazon has today than what any of these vendors have today.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, the next question is, and I'll quote, repeated references to reducing documentation burden and needing more actionable data and care coordination, to my mind, all centers on clinical workflow. Said differently, what is needed and what a true API economy in healthcare can enable are laser-focused clinical workflow-centric user interfaces. Did this topic come up in your discussions? And, if so, in what way? Who are the exemplars in developing truly workflow-centric tools?
Well, I think the short answer to that question is that there are no exemplars in healthcare. I mean, I think we mentioned at the outset that best practices for a lot of this stuff exist outside healthcare. That said, the number of times that the inadequacies of clinical workflow was described is essentially in some sense, this was really the whole discussion. I don't think that there is any question but that EHRs need to be reconceptualized. They need to approach the entire problem of making observations about patients in order to support diagnosis and treatment in a different way. And that is probably an unsatisfying answer because it's not definitive. I don't think that anybody has a magic formula, but I think it is a question that's very much on everybody's mind. At least the folks that we talk to for this project.
Okay, the next question we have is wondering if we will still be left with semantic interoperability issues regardless of the mechanism of integration.
Well, the great promise of FHIR is that you issue a GET, a FHIR compliant GET, and you're going to get you're going to get a similarly formatted response regardless of the EHR brand. Now that that has not been tested, and I do think that there is some level of concern in the industry about variants, vendor-specific variants that undermine the kind of semantic interoperability that you're talking about. But semantic interoperability is not an easy problem, and so I think there's hopes that FHIR can certainly do something to address it, but it is particularly when you talk to the informaticists, the way that knowledge is represented and the kind of terminology that people use continues to be a bugaboo here, and so I'm not sure if it's going to completely address it, but I do think it's going to help.
All right, the next question is, will FHIR improve the ease of drive-by interoperability based on cooperation in projects like Argonaut and IHE, or will each vendor have to sit down and analyze if they can use the API they built with vendor A to connect immediately with vendor B?
Well, as I said, FHIR is supposed to be a lingua franca. So but the reality is probably going to be a little bit different. Drive-by interoperability is, I think it's a great term. I'm not sure that, at least initially, that we're going to be in that kind of. I'm a little bit dubious, I guess, but I do think 10 years from now, drive-by interoperability might be a more realistic thing. But it's a great question.
All right, next. Do any of the large or small EHR vendors allow open API access to third-party developers in order to transform fragmented diagnostic test results data into actionable information for both physicians and their patients?
Well, I think they would all tell you that they do, at least with respect to physicians. Um, uh, but I think the reality is that there's no such thing as open APIs in healthcare. As I said at the outset, if insofar as you use any EHR vendor's API, you have a contract with that vendor. So and that's appropriate. Clearly you got to make sure that people's healthcare data isn't flying around willy-nilly. But again, I'm not sure that we are completely there yet.
Okay, this will be our final question for today. OCR has said patient-directed API access is effectively zero cost. Does this drive API adoption, and if so, how?
Yeah, I'm not sure zero cost is, well, I'll put it this way. I'm pretty sure that the EHR vendors would not describe it as zero cost. And I forgot the last part of the question there. Oh, so I mean, as we said, I think that the lots of people need access to these APIs, and there's certainly a tremendous focus on building patient-facing applications that use these APIs. But I do think that that there's going to be more focus on clinicians, at least initially. I think that the problem with EHRs is so acute, and there's such a level of grumbling that it strikes me that it is low-hanging fruit.
All right, well, thank you everyone for taking the time to join us this afternoon. We greatly appreciate your attendance and sticking with us through the entire webinar. If you have any additional questions that were not addressed during the webinar or the Q&A period, please feel free to email either myself or Brian. I can be reached at john3@chilmarkresearch.com, and if you want to reach out to Brian directly, you can reach him at brian@chilmarkresearch.com. These slides will be available for download. I will be sending out a link following the webinar if you did not download it directly from the handout section. And then we'll also be sending out a notice with the release of the report next week. So keep a lookout for that in your inboxes. And I hope you all have a great rest of the week and holiday break. Thank you again.